First one is going to be, don't underestimate the damage the tongue can do. And the second is, don't underestimate what God can do for good. About 10 to 12 years ago, I can't remember how long, I was doing one of my daily chores that I would do every once in a while. I would do some grocery shopping before I got ready for work. And on that particular morning, I went and Stop and Shop at that time was opened at 6 a.m. So I pull in, there's nobody around, no cars, so I get the prime parking spot up front, closest to the door, and I'm walking in, and a booming voice yells out, "There's a lot of hypocrites in the church." And I'm like, oh my goodness. So I'm afraid to look behind me, but then I figure, well, it's probably one of you folks trying to be funny, so I give it a shot. I look back, and there's this 6-foot-tall young man that I've never seen before, and he is rapidly closing the distance between us. I think, oh my goodness. So I'm up for a spiritual talk with strangers once in a while, so I'm going to let this carry out. So I stand there and I'm waiting for him to come up, and he starts talking, but he strays off the topic. He's no longer interested in talking about hypocrisy in the church, which is okay. And my end game is going to be inviting him here. So that goes back and forth, and when I get to that part of inviting him here, he makes it clear that he is attending somewhere else, and there's someone there that cares about him. So much for that, but our conversation continues, and if you asked us how the conversation's going, I think we both would have said, this guy's not making a lot of sense. But the conversation ends, and we part ways, and I would see him one more time after that. So I'll leave that cliffhanger there for now. In the news, we've been watching the results of the fire in LA, and it's devastating. Some of these photos, it looks like I just can't even grasp what was there before, and now we just see rubble and ash, and it got me thinking, 100 years from now, are they going to be talking about this fire? Because when I was a kid, and some of you that are my age and older will remember the Great Chicago Fire that we learned about, the one started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow, allegedly, and 300 people died in that one. 2,000 acres burned up, and the conditions for that fire were a very dry summer. This fire happened in October. A terrible wind, and Chicago was mainly built with wood. Even the sidewalks were made with wood. So when that started, the embers would blow all over the place, and the city went up in flames. Even the embers would cross the Chicago River and burning the inside of the interior of the Chicago. 300 people died, 17,000 buildings destroyed, and we always have that image in our mind of Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern. That was all a lie, by the way, if you read up on that. They drew a picture of that in the paper, but the man who drew that picture lied about that. And the fire did start in that barn on Mrs. O'Leary's property, and she lived the remaining years of her life devastated by that. She took the blame of that right to her grave, and she didn't recover from that. Likewise, we'd have a hard time being responsible for a major fire or disaster, and yet the Bible warns us to be careful with what we say, because that can start a fire in someone's life. You remember Peter had in Matthew 16:21, Jesus is telling them, his disciples, that he's going to go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised up on the third day. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This shall never happen to you." But he turned, Jesus, and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." Now, I don't think Peter was intentionally hurting Jesus. I think he loved Jesus, and his primary thought was to make sure that he was protecting Jesus and making sure that this horrible death would never happen to him. And we see this play out on the night of the arrest. Peter pulls out the sword when they come to arrest Jesus, and he's going to give his life for his friend Jesus. But that's what Jesus came for. He gave his life for Peter and for us. And Peter was meant to live for Jesus and feed his sheep. But notice how unintentionally Peter brought Jesus into temptation. That's not your mission. You can save your skin, and I'm going to help you. And then Jesus tells him, "You are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." We can do the same damage unintentionally. Peter got it all mixed up. When we tell someone else their problems, or without knowing the backstory, or we don't understand the big picture, and we tell them what they're doing wrong, or are critical of something, or something that's not grounded in love, but just something we want to pick at and tell them, where they need improvement, we can cause just as much damage. Because we don't have all the information all the time about each other. Listen to Jesus' words in Matthew 12:36. "But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment." Imagine that. On the day of judgment, me being led to my careless words. I can imagine a big pile. Hopefully it's not a mountain. But the next verse says, "For by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned." Can you imagine seeing all these horrible words that were careless, without thought, that I have to make an account for? And you'll be in the same spot too. That's not something I look forward to doing. We need to be more careful about how we treat each other, and being careless, because we don't understand what people are dealing with all the time. We don't have 100% surety about someone's past. They may be working on their issues. One of my favorite verses in Matthew, it's a quote of Isaiah, talking about Isaiah's looking forward to Jesus and what he'll be like. It says, "A battered reed he will not break off, and a smoldering wick he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory." There's not much hope for a battered reed. It can barely stand up by itself. It can't support itself, and there's no future for it. But Jesus knows how to heal those type of people. The smoldering wick he will not put out. Well, that's great news. There's hope that when our religious zeal is waning and about to be extinguished, we look to Jesus to fan the flames. Let's make sure our speech is Christ-like, giving others with a smoldering wick hope. Now, that's one side of the coin for unintentional offenses. There's also a darker side of the coin of, and you've heard people say this before, and hopefully you haven't been on the wrong end of this, but somebody's going to tell you what you need to hear, and what you do with it, that's your problem. There's a dark side to that. Basically, I'm going to, without regard for your history, for your background, for what you're going through now, I'm going to give you a truth bomb. And what you do with it, I did my part. I gave you what you need to hear. Now deal with it. It can almost come out, say, I couldn't care less about you, but here's the truth. We need to be more careful about how we treat others. James 3, 5, and 6. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Well, that sounds like a proverb. That's good advice. We should understand that. But listen to this next verse. This should send shivers up our spine. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. That's tough. Anytime you start reading about an action that we could take that ends with setting on fire by hell, we need to pay more attention. All right, I'm going to move on to point number 2. Don't underestimate what God can do. Our reading this morning was Luke 19. Jesus entering through Jericho. There was a man by the name of Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector, and he was rich. A chief tax collector back then was basically a traitor to his countrymen. And the Romans would know what they wanted in their tax. And it was up to the tax collector to go get it, but also that was their livelihood. So there was that occupation was rife with fraud and thievery. So when we read that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector and was rich, he doesn't have a lot of friends, let's put it that way. Interestingly, he's trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. And I don't know how word spread back then. I don't know. When did they know Jesus was coming? When this huge crowd that was following him was coming down the road, and I said they would yell out, "Oh, I think Jesus is coming." Or if somebody ran ahead and said, "Jesus is going to be here in 12 hours," he said so. So there would be people lined up to see him or waiting for him. But Zacchaeus isn't there in time. I wonder if nobody ever told him because he didn't have any friends. So he had to do the next best thing, and he had to run in the opposite direction and wait for Jesus' path to cross. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down there, for today I must stay at your house." And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. How great that Jesus would care so much about someone who the world has already disposed of. Verse 7, when they saw it, they all began to grumble. "He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." There's going to be a cost sometimes for caring about people that the world has discarded or don't care about. But it doesn't keep us from caring about them. I heard a story about a man at Tower Records. Back then they would produce music on vinyl, believe it or not, for those of you too young to remember that. And they were saying, he had a bunch of friends, and they were giving this documentary and saying what a great guy he was. And they interviewed one man that at that time was down on his luck and was feeling sorry for himself because he had lost his job. And he was around the house, and I believe it was his wife said, "You should get out of the house, go down and meet your friends, and just hang out with your buddies, and maybe they'll cheer you up." So he did, and he talked about this man. And when he went in, the man saw him and said he was so happy to see him, and he said, "You should come out to dinner with us and hang out with us." And as the man described this invitation 3 decades later, he started to tear up. Why would he care about a dinner invitation from 30 years ago? Because it was the right time. He needed that at that point in his life, and he remembered that forever. Just imagine how God uses us, or can use us, or does use us, when somebody is seeking. Zacchaeus didn't realize he was going to have an invite to dinner. He probably never crossed his mind to invite Jesus to his house, but Jesus has invited himself. So we can help others by paying attention to the little things and making sure that we don't assume that people aren't seeking, because we might come along at the right time, at God's time. I know a man that started reading his Bible because a friend sent him a note with a Bible verse in it. So let's keep others in mind and make sure that we're always doing the Lord's work, even if it's something small.